It started with a scream, not from the victims, but from the one who found them. On a quiet Sunday evening, in one of the wealthiest zip codes in Los Angeles, police received a frantic 911 call from a young woman trembling so violently, the dispatcher could barely understand her. That woman was Romy Reiner, the 27-year-old daughter of Hollywood legend Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle Singer. Her voice shook with terror as she gasped the words that would trigger one of the most shocking investigations in modern celebrity history. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. They're dead. My parents. They're dead. And I think I know who did it. What happened next would shatter the pristine illusion of Hollywood royalty and rip open the secrets of a family thought to be untouchable. A brutal double homicide, a son under arrest, and then a discovery so chilling, even hardened FBI agents would struggle to believe it was real. What did they find inside Nick Reiner's bedroom? And why did it change everything we thought we knew about the case? Let's rewind. The Reiners were no ordinary family. Rob Reiner, a name etched into the very bones of American film and television, was more than just an actor or director. He was a cultural icon. From All in the Family to A Few Good Men, Stand By Me to The Princess Bride, Rob's creative fingerprint touched generations. Michelle Singer Reiner, his wife of over 30 years, wasn't just the woman behind the man. She was a powerhouse in her own right, a political activist, philanthropist, and producer. Together, they were Hollywood aristocracy. And their family? To the outside world, a blend of intellect, talent, and charm. But appearances lie, and sometimes they hide monsters. On Sunday, December 14th, inside their $13.5 million Brentwood estate, the illusion was shattered. Rob and Michelle were found stabbed to death, multiple sharp force injuries, according to the coroner's report. The autopsy was swift, the cause of death unmistakable. Homicide. But even more disturbing than the violence was the location of their son Nick Reiner. Just steps away, living in the guest house. Not on vacation. Not out of town. He was home. The whole time. When police found Nick that night, his hands were clean, his expression calm. He was cooperative, but distant. As if this wasn't a murder. As if it were an inconvenience. Within hours, Nick Reiner, Hollywood screenwriter, former addict, and the troubled son of two beloved figures, was under arrest for double homicide. But that was just the beginning. Because what the FBI found later inside Nick's bedroom would raise more questions than it answered. There was no murder weapon in the main house. No blood trail leading from victim to killer. No defensive wounds on Nick. No signs of a break-in. So how had two healthy adults, both in their 70s but still active, ended up so brutally murdered without alerting a soul? That question would consume detectives, and it would lead them to a room no one wanted to open. Nick Reiner's bedroom. Now, here's where things spiral into the unthinkable. At first glance, the room seemed almost normal. A little messy, sure. Scattered clothes, movie posters, an unmade bed. But nothing screamed murder. Nothing dripped with horror. At least not on the surface. But when agents began pulling apart the layers, inside drawers, under floorboards, behind picture frames, that's when everything started to change. What they found wasn't just evidence. It was a map of madness. A manifesto of rage. And, perhaps most disturbing of all, a prophecy. Have you ever looked at someone and wondered, what are they hiding? That's what agents began to ask themselves as they unfolded a journal buried at the back of Nick's nightstand. It was leather-bound, scuffed at the edges. Looked old, but the ink was fresh. Pages of handwritten text, some of it coherent, most of it chaotic. Obsessive, angry, fixated on his family. Entries like, "They treat me like an accident they're ashamed of. They think because they gave me money, they can own me. One day I'll take back the narrative, and they'll listen." Even if it's the last thing they ever do. Was it the ranting of a mentally unwell man? Or something more sinister? A premeditated confession, veiled in metaphor? As you'll soon see, this journal was only the first clue. When they lifted the mattress, they found something else. A hard drive, taped flat against the frame, hidden behind insulation. Password protected, but not for long. What was on that drive would send chills down every spine in the room. Videos, audio, plans, rants. A digital diary of delusion, and maybe even a blueprint for murder. And yet, As jaw-dropping as the footage was, it wasn't the worst thing they'd find. Because tucked beneath the floorboard, loosened just enough to slide something in, agents discovered a sealed black box. Inside it, let's just say that what was hidden inside that box would send this case spiraling in a direction no one could have predicted. This wasn't just a murder. It was a message. A message written in blood, silence, and secrets. But here's the terrifying question. Who was that message meant for? And even more chilling, was Nick the only one involved? Because when investigators re-examined the timeline, the phone logs, and the motion sensors around the property, they realized something devastating. There may have been someone else inside that house. Someone no one was talking about. Someone who disappeared right after the murders. So ask yourself this. How far would you go to uncover the truth, if the truth might destroy an entire legacy? Because that's exactly what this story is about. A fall from grace, a family in ruins, and a bedroom that became a crime scene long before the murders ever happened. And what came next? Well, it would change everything. What if the real crime scene wasn't the living room? What if it wasn't the kitchen? What if it wasn't even the place where Rob and Michelle Reiner took their final breaths? What if the crime scene had existed for years, quietly forming behind a closed bedroom door? That was the question haunting investigators as they stood in the narrow hallway outside Nick Reiner's room. The air felt heavier there, colder, as if the house itself knew something unspeakable had lived behind that door long before anyone died. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and instantly feel uncomfortable, even though you can't explain why. That's what agents later described. Nothing jumped out at first. No blood on the walls. No overturned furniture. No obvious signs of violence. Just silence. The kind that presses against your ears. But silence can be louder than screams. By the time the FBI officially entered the investigation, local detectives had already hit a wall. The evidence didn't make sense. Too clean. Too controlled. Too intentional. Rob and Michelle had suffered multiple sharp force injuries. That alone told investigators this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't random. This was personal. And yet, there was no frantic struggle captured on security cameras. No neighbors heard anything. No signs of forced entry. So ask yourself this. How do two people get brutally murdered in a multi-million-dollar estate without anyone noticing? The answer, investigators feared, was horrifyingly simple. The killer knew the house. The killer knew the routines. The killer knew where sound traveled and where it didn't. The killer lived there. Nick Reiner had always been the complicated one. That's how family friends described him. Complicated. Sensitive. Brilliant, even. But volatile. Prone to anger. Prone to spirals. A man who could charm a room one moment and shut down entirely the next. To the public, he was a struggling screenwriter. A creative soul overshadowed by a famous father. To those close to the family, he was something else entirely. A ticking clock. Former friends would later tell investigators that Nick had long believed his parents were controlling his destiny, that they sabotaged his career, that they used money as leverage, that they loved him conditionally. And Nick hated conditions. He hated being dependent. He hated being monitored. He hated being told no, especially by Rob. Inside Nick's bedroom, that resentment had a voice. It was subtle at first, easy to miss. A sentence scribbled in a notebook. A line typed into a document. A comment buried inside a draft script no one else ever read. But when agents started laying the pieces side by side, a pattern emerged. And once you see a pattern like that, you can't unsee it. Nick didn't just write stories about violence. He wrote stories about control, about parents who deserved consequences, about justice delivered not by courts, but by sons. Was it fiction or rehearsal? That question would become central to everything that followed. And then there was the timeline. December 14th. That date would haunt the investigation. Because before the autopsy confirmed it, no one could quite agree on when Rob and Michelle actually died. Some neighbors thought they saw lights late Sunday night. Others claimed the house had gone dark much earlier. Nick said he went to his room early. Romy said she hadn't heard anything until she found the bodies. Security logs showed movement, but not where it mattered most. And buried deep in the data was something chilling. Motion sensors inside Nick's bedroom recorded activity during a window of time when he claimed to be asleep. Not frantic movement. Not pacing. Controlled motion. Like someone preparing. Have you ever noticed how people reveal their true selves when they think no one is watching? That's what the FBI believed they were seeing. A private version of Nick Reiner. One that didn't exist in interviews. One that didn't show up in court appearances. One that lived in margins and folders and hidden compartments. And the deeper they went, the clearer it became. This wasn't a sudden snap. This was a slow burn. One agent reportedly said something that would later leak to the press. This didn't feel like a crime of passion. It felt like the final chapter of a story that had been written for years. Let that sink in. Final chapter, meaning there were earlier ones. Ones no one had taken seriously enough. Arguments dismissed as family drama. Threats brushed off as emotional outbursts. Warnings explained away as overreactions. Until there were no more warnings left. And then there was Romy, the daughter, the witness, the one who made the call. Her role would become one of the most debated aspects of the case. Why had she immediately suggested a suspect? Why had she used the word dangerous? Why did her statement sound less shocked and more resigned? Some people said she was brave. Others said she was scared. A few whispered something else entirely. That she knew. And if she knew, the question becomes unavoidable. How long had she known? Investigators would later discover that Romy had urged her parents to take precautions months before their deaths. That she had mentioned feeling uneasy around her brother. That she had stopped bringing friends to the house. But none of it was documented officially. No police reports. No restraining orders. No paper trail. Just conversations. Family conversations. The kind that disappear when it's too late. Meanwhile, Nick sat in custody, eerily composed. No tears. No rage. No visible grief. When asked about his parents, he spoke in abstract terms. As if discussing characters, not people. They had their own choices, he said at one point. So did I. That line alone sent chills through the room. Because it sounded less like denial and more like justification. Here's something most people don't realize. Criminal investigations aren't just about evidence. They're about psychology. About understanding who someone believes they are. And Nick Reiner believed he was misunderstood. Wronged. Trapped in a narrative written by someone else. Until, perhaps, he decided to rewrite it. By the time the black box was found inside his bedroom, agents were already bracing for something bad. But no one was prepared for what it contained. Because inside that box wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was evidence of intent. Documents labeled with dates. Notes referencing inevitability. And a phrase repeated over and over again in different handwriting styles. They'll listen in the end. Listen to what? Listen to who? That question would haunt everyone connected to this case. This is the moment where the story stops being about a tragedy and starts becoming something much darker. Because once you accept the possibility that this was planned, everything changes. The motive, the timeline, the suspects, even the meaning of silence. So let me ask you something. How many warning signs does it take before a family accepts the unthinkable? How many red flags can love ignore? And at what point does protecting someone become enabling them? These are uncomfortable questions, but they sit at the heart of this story. As the FBI prepared to inventory everything inside Nick Reiner's bedroom, they had no idea that one specific discovery would redefine the entire investigation. Not a weapon, not blood, something far worse. Something that suggested the murders weren't the beginning of the story. They were the conclusion. And the next thing agents uncovered would force them to confront a terrifying possibility. That what happened on December 14th wasn't just foreseeable. It was foretold. But what came next? What the FBI found beneath the floorboards would change everything. Brentwood is the kind of place where the hedges are manicured, the driveways are gated, and the silence is intentional. The kind of place where people smile through tinted windows, where homes are bought with legacy money, and where tragedy feels imported, not homegrown. Until the night it was. The Reiner estate sat on a slope, modern, sprawling, designed with privacy in mind. Walls of glass, marble floors. Art that cost more than most people's homes. A gate that buzzed when approached. A line of cypress trees that shielded the guest house like it was a secret. But secrets don't stay buried forever. And this estate? It wasn't just a Hollywood dream. It was a pressure cooker. You ever walk into a house that looks perfect, but something just feels off? That's what officers reported as they stepped through the double doors after Romy Reiner's 911 call. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from aftermath. In the front foyer, there was no sign of forced entry. No broken locks. No smashed windows. Just a winter coat still hanging by the door and 2 pairs of slippers neatly placed beside the hall bench. As if nothing had happened. As if Rob and Michelle were still there. But then you follow the silence down the hall. You turn left. You enter the sitting room. And everything changes. The bodies were found near the fireplace. Rob Reiner was face down, his hands beneath him, a deep wound across his back. Blood had seeped into the Persian rug, dark, almost black under the chandelier glow. Michelle lay a few feet away, near the grand piano. One hand outstretched. Defensive wounds visible even in the low light. Her wedding ring glinted beside her fingertips, as if clinging to the idea of commitment, even in death. The scene was surgical, precise, not the chaos of a break-in or struggle. No drawers were open. No valuables missing. Dinner plates still sat untouched on the dining room table. That table, by the way, it had been set for 3. So who was the third person supposed to be? A friend? A neighbor? Their son? That question would haunt the investigation for days. Because when officers entered the guest house at the back of the property, they found Nick Reiner fully dressed, scrolling through his phone, earbuds in, a script open on his laptop. As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't heard a thing. When they asked if he'd seen his parents that evening, he replied flatly, "No, I think they had dinner plans." But that was a lie. And it wasn't the only one. Security logs would later show that Nick had exited the main house just before 10 p.m., the same window in which police believe the murders took place. His keycard had been used twice. Once to enter, once to leave. No sign of anyone else. So what really happened in those missing minutes? And why did Nick seem so calm? Neighbors offered few insights. One couple recalled seeing Nick jogging earlier that day. Alone. Sweatshirt on, hood up. Didn't wave. Didn't smile. Just kept running. Another neighbor, a dog walker, claimed to hear raised voices on Saturday night coming from the guest house. Though they couldn't make out what was said. It sounded like a fight, they later told police. Or maybe someone arguing with themselves. Strange, right? But here's the real kicker. Nobody saw or heard anything on Sunday night. Not a single sound. No alarm. No screams. Just silence. How do you kill 2 people in a house that big without anyone noticing? Simple. You know the layout. You know the angles. You know which rooms don't echo. You've lived there. Let's talk about the house itself. The main estate was over 8,000 square feet. 6 bedrooms. 8 bathrooms. A recording studio. A library. A private theater. The guest house. Roughly 1,200 square feet. 1 bedroom. 1 bath. Hidden behind dense landscaping. Connected by a stone path with 0 visibility from the street. Perfect for privacy. Even better for hiding. But what most people didn't know was that the guest house had a basement, originally used for storage, later converted into a private workspace for Nick. No cameras. No sensors. No records. Just soundproof walls, concrete floors, and a lock from the inside. When agents finally searched that basement, what they found was unnerving. A desk, an old projector, wall scribbles and faded red marker, and rows of stacked notebooks. Dozens of them, all labeled with titles like Scripts They'll Never Let Me Make, Unfinished Revenge, Therapy Notes, the real versions. One notebook in particular had a title that gave an agent pause. Why December 14th matters. We'll get to that later, but keep it in mind. Meanwhile, upstairs, agents started putting together a psychological map of the estate. This wasn't just a house. It was a labyrinth of control. Certain doors were reinforced. Certain windows had blackout shades. And inside Rob's office was a locked drawer with handwritten letters addressed to Nick, never mailed. Letters filled with worry, regret, and fear. We're trying, Nick. But you have to want to meet us halfway. We don't recognize you anymore. Please get help. Before something happens we can't undo. Those letters, investigators later said, were heartbreaking, but also chilling. Because they hinted at something bigger. Not just a troubled son. Not just a rocky relationship. But a family that felt unsafe in their own home. And here's the contradiction that stopped everyone in their tracks. In public, the Reiners had always seemed united. Award shows, red carpet events, fundraisers, smiling, holding hands, laughing. They were Hollywood's warmest family, the gold standard. But behind closed doors, an entirely different story. A story of late-night arguments. of missed therapy sessions, of a son who felt abandoned, and a father who didn't know how to help him, and a mother caught in between. There was one photo that agents found inside Michelle's closet. It was turned face down. It was a family portrait. Nick, Romy, Rob, and Michelle, all dressed in black, smiling wide, taken during a Vanity Fair shoot a decade ago. Behind that photo was a note Michelle had scribbled on a torn scrap of envelope. "He scares me now, but I still see glimpses of the boy I raised." Let that sink in. Even she saw it coming. She just didn't know what to do. And Romy? She didn't sleep at the house anymore. Hadn't for months. She'd later tell police it wasn't because of her schedule. It was because she didn't feel comfortable under the same roof as Nick. So why didn't anyone intervene? The answer is painfully common. Because when it's family, you hope, you bargain, you delay, until delay becomes tragedy. Here's what no one wants to admit. Sometimes the most dangerous people in your life are the ones who know your routine, your weaknesses, your patience. And in the case of the Reiners, that patience cost them everything. But we're not done yet. Because just when investigators thought they had their bearings, victims, motive, suspect, timeline, the bedroom threw them a curveball. It wasn't the hidden journal. It wasn't the sealed black box. It wasn't even the floorboard discovery. It was what they found on Nick's laptop. A script, untitled, Draft 7. And the final scene? A man stands over two bodies in a lavish home, blood dripping from a knife. He looks into the camera and says, "This is what it took for them to listen." End scene. But what came next would tear open everything the FBI thought they understood, and no one saw it coming. Let's not sugarcoat it. Nick Reiner was born into power, heir to a legacy most people can only dream of. The son of Rob Reiner, a man who defined American pop culture through comedy, drama, and courtroom tension, and grandson to Carl Reiner, a comedy godfather whose fingerprints are all over television history. If Hollywood had royalty, Nick was born in a castle. But fairy tales lie. Because behind the last name, behind the red carpets and premieres, was a boy who never quite fit in. A kid whose last name opened every door, but made every room feel like a spotlight he didn't ask for. You ever meet someone who seems allergic to expectations? That was Nick. To some, he was brilliant. To others, he was brooding. To everyone, he was complicated. Even as a child, teachers described him as intense and resistant to structure. He didn't like rules. He didn't like being told what to do. And he hated being compared to his father. But how do you avoid comparison when your father is Rob Reiner? Every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every party invitation came with the pressure of living up to a legend. Some kids rise to it. Nick didn't. Let's talk about the public version of Nick Reiner. In the early 2010s, he was writing screenplays. Co-wrote the semi-autobiographical indie film Being Charlie, which was based loosely on his real-life struggle with addiction. The film debuted at the Toronto International Film Festival, received a lukewarm reception, and disappeared quietly. Critics praised its rawness, but one comment stood out. "It feels like a cry for help, wrapped in an artistic mask." That comment didn't sit well with Nick. Because for him, Being Charlie wasn't art. It was confession. But when confession becomes product, when your trauma becomes something people review on Rotten Tomatoes, how do you hold on to your truth? Maybe you don't. In private, Nick battled demons that the cameras never saw. He entered rehab at 16, again at 19, again at 24. Substance abuse, mental health episodes, unexplained disappearances. At one point, he allegedly stayed off the grid for nearly 3 months, living out of his car in Oregon, claiming he was reconnecting with silence. His parents tried to help. They funded treatment centers. They brought in therapists. They enrolled him in holistic programs, including a retreat in New Mexico focused on trauma recovery. But nothing stuck. Not because Nick didn't want to change, but because, as one therapist wrote in a now unsealed court document, Nick doesn't trust transformation that isn't on his terms. Let that sentence sink in. He wanted control. Total control. And that brings us to the deeper issue. Control was more than a preference for Nick. It was an obsession. Multiple girlfriends spoke to law enforcement after his arrest. Several of them independently used the same words to describe him. Charming at first, controlling later. He hated being disagreed with. He didn't explode. He imploded silently. It's the kind of behavior that flies under the radar. No bruises. No screaming matches in public, but a quiet erosion. A whisper that turns into a scream inside your own head. That's what Nick did to people close to him. And that's what, many believe, he eventually did to his family. Now, let's not pretend he didn't have moments of clarity. There were periods where Nick appeared to genuinely seek healing. In therapy, he opened up about childhood insecurities, about feeling like a shadow in a house of giants, about wishing his name didn't come with a legacy, just a clean slate. But the problem with legacies is they follow you. And the problem with clean slates is you have to clean them yourself. Nick never got there. Instead, his writing grew darker. Agents discovered dozens of draft scripts on his laptop and hard drive. Not public work. Not shared with agents or studios. Private work. Stories of sons betrayed by parents. Of men who orchestrated vengeance under the guise of justice. Of characters who had to destroy the legacy in order to be free. Let me repeat that. Destroy the legacy to be free. Sound familiar? It should. Because that's exactly what investigators believed Nick did. But here's where it gets even darker. Several scripts included characters clearly modeled after Rob and Michelle Reiner. Their mannerisms, their phrases, their speech patterns. One draft included a father who uses his son's trauma as screenwriting material. Another featured a mother who dismisses her son's pleas for help, only to be later found murdered in her garden. And in every single draft, the son character was the survivor. He was always the one left standing. Sometimes he was redeemed. Sometimes he was a villain. But he was always alive. Ask yourself, is that art? Or is that preparation? When the FBI brought in a behavioral analyst, her conclusion was stark. These scripts aren't fiction. They're rehearsals. Emotional dress rehearsals for a psychological reality he couldn't bring himself to face. Until he did. And that's what chilled everyone in the room. Nick didn't snap. He practiced. Over and over again. On paper. In private. Until one day, he didn't need the script anymore. Let's go back to his childhood, briefly. People love to blame parenting in cases like this. And sure, there are plenty of whispers. That Rob was distant. That Michelle was passive. That the family prioritized image over intimacy. But the truth is more complicated. By all accounts, the Reiners tried. Tried to support. Tried to intervene. Tried to love a son they didn't fully understand. But love isn't always enough. Not when the person you're trying to reach doesn't want to be reached. And Nick didn't want connection. He wanted control. Control over the narrative. Control over the household. Control over the legacy he was born into but never chose. And when control didn't come willingly, he took it. In the most violent way imaginable. But here's a contradiction that haunts this entire case. Even after the murders, Nick didn't run. He didn't flee the city. He didn't hide. He went back to the guest house. Put on his earbuds, and started typing. Was it delusion? Was it detachment? Or was it satisfaction? A job completed. A story fulfilled. One that had been brewing for years, in journals, scripts, and therapy notes. One that only needed 2 final characters to die. And yet, despite the horror, there's one line Nick wrote in a recovered email draft that still leaves everyone unsettled. I didn't do this to hurt them. I did this so they'd finally hear me. That line has been debated by psychologists, reporters, and courtroom pundits ever since. Was it sincere? Was it twisted logic? Or was it the final justification of a man who couldn't stand to be ignored? We may never fully understand what Nick Reiner was thinking when he made his final move. But what we can understand is that it didn't come from nowhere. It came from years of boiling resentment, from unprocessed pain, from a warped need to be seen, no matter the cost. And in the end, that cost was everything. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't his writing. It wasn't his past. It wasn't even his behavior. It was what he left behind in the crime scene. Not the blood. Not the bodies. A single page torn from a notebook. Folded. Placed neatly on the nightstand. 5 words. The story ends like this. But what the FBI uncovered next, inside the Reiner home's surveillance system, would flip the entire investigation on its head and reveal that Nick might not have acted alone. There are crime scenes, and then there are crime stories, the ones that don't just shock you, but haunt you. That's what Brentwood detectives walked into on December 14th. They thought they were responding to a domestic disturbance, maybe a wellness check. At worst, a robbery gone wrong. But what they stepped into inside the Reiner estate was a stage built for something much darker. Even the most seasoned officers said the energy shifted the moment they crossed the threshold. Something about the way the air felt. The tension. The absence of normal. It wasn't just that Rob and Michelle Reiner were dead. It was how they had died. The first thing officers noticed? The stillness. There were no signs of a struggle in the entrance. No broken furniture. No blood spatters along the main hallway. Everything was in place. The artwork untouched. The plants watered. A scented candle still burning on the kitchen island. It was the kind of eerie calm that made one detective whisper. It's like the house didn't know it had witnessed a murder. But the dining room told a different story. The table had been set for three. 3 place settings. 3 wine glasses. 3 linen napkins. A pot roast in the center. Still warm. 2 plates untouched. The third? Missing. And 2 chairs? Pulled slightly out. One as if someone had risen quickly. The other knocked on its side. Officers would later confirm that only Rob and Michelle's fingerprints were found on those 2 wine glasses. So who was the third guest? Rob Reiner's body was found slumped over in a side chair, one hand clenched at his side. Blood had pooled under him, soaking into the vintage rug. A single stab wound, deep, deliberate, between his shoulder blades. No sign of struggle, just precision, like someone had approached from behind. Someone trusted. Michelle's body was found 4 feet away, near the piano bench. Unlike Rob, she had defensive wounds. Deep cuts across her arms, bruising on her knuckles, scratches beneath her nails. She had fought back. Hard. But she'd lost. There were 3 fatal wounds to her torso and a shallow laceration to her throat. Investigators noted the brutality and the inconsistency. Because here's the twist. Rob's murder was clinical. Michelle's was emotional. Why? Why such a violent contrast? Now let's talk about blood spatter. The forensic team noted something unusual, the lack of it. Typically, in a stabbing, blood arcs, especially in close quarters. But here, almost none on the walls. Very little on surrounding furniture. Only the victims' bodies and the rug were soaked. The angle and direction of the wounds suggested the attacker knew exactly where to strike and how to avoid getting splashed. For someone untrained, that's nearly impossible. So was this someone who had rehearsed? More questions. In the sink? No dishes. No cleanup attempt. In the trash? Nothing suspicious. In the dishwasher? 1 single steak knife. Clean. But that knife? It didn't match the wounds. The blade was too short, the serration pattern didn't align with the injuries. So the murder weapon? Still missing. Even stranger, the knife block on the counter had a gap. 1 large knife, missing from the set. To the trained eye, that was a clue. To the FBI, it was a statement. The killer hadn't brought a weapon. They'd used one from the house. That suggested comfort, familiarity, intimacy. Not an intruder, a family member. But the biggest bombshell came from the motion sensors. The Reiner estate was fitted with a top-tier smart security system. Each room had motion-activated lighting and time-stamped recordings. The system didn't store video, but it tracked movement. According to the logs, there was movement in the kitchen at 6:48 p.m. Then again in the dining room at 7:03 p.m. Rob and Michelle were both alive then. At 7:51 p.m., the living room sensor activated. Then silence. No movement. No doors opened. No alarms triggered. Until 10:12 p.m., when motion was recorded inside Nick's bedroom. And at 10:16 p.m., the guest house front door opened. So what happened between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock? Was the killer sitting there with them? Here's where things get even stranger. Romy Reiner's 911 call came at 11:09 p.m. She said she had been texting her parents all evening, but hadn't gotten a reply. She arrived unexpectedly, using her spare key. Found the house eerily dark, the candles still flickering. And then she saw them. Her scream alerted a neighbor, who called 911 too. But the question remains. Was someone still in the house when Romy arrived? Investigators did a full sweep of the estate that night. No signs of forced entry. No hidden guest. All windows locked. But one door caught their attention. The basement entrance in the guest house. It was ajar. When they followed the steps down, they found a storage room that had been converted into something else. A desk. A wall covered in post-it notes. A stack of journals. A half-burnt candle. No blood. No body. But the vibe? Deeply disturbing. One detective described it like walking into the mind of someone who planned to be famous for all the wrong reasons. But here's the true shocker. Behind a bookshelf was a crawl space. Tiny, barely big enough for a grown man to crouch inside. Inside it, they found a discarded hoodie, an empty energy drink can, a crumpled script, and a phone, turned off. The hoodie had faint blood residue, later matched to Rob Reiner. So now picture this. The house is spotless. The scene is surgical. But the guest house? A ticking time bomb of rage, obsession, and darkness. And the person living there? Nick Reiner. Let's not forget the symbolism of it all. The main house, the place of wealth, fame, and control, is pristine. The guest house, the outsider's space, the second-tier family member, is chaotic, unfiltered, raw. It wasn't just a physical divide. It was psychological. Nick didn't just live in a different building. He lived in a different reality. And then came the blood droplets. On the back porch, just near the side garden, a technician found something tiny, almost invisible. 3 small drops of blood, nearly dried. Not enough to leave a trail. Not enough to scream murderer, but enough to test. One matched Michelle Reiner. Another matched an unknown profile. And the third? Nick. But Nick had no visible wounds. So how did his blood end up outside? Now, we can't ignore the possibility that there was someone else. The unknown DNA, found on a porch step, wasn't in any database. No match. So was Nick alone? Or did someone help? That question would drive the case forward. And eventually, split the investigation in 2 directions. One team focused on Nick. The other started looking at Romy. Because when investigators cross-referenced the phone data, they found a deleted text from Nick to Romy just 3 hours before the murders. They don't get it. I need you to stay away tonight. Things are going to change. Romy never responded. But she did delete the message. Why? That one act, deleting a message, would later be dissected endlessly in court. Was she scared? Was she protecting him? Did she know more than she said? Or was it just instinct? We'll explore that later. But for now, the takeaway is this. The crime scene wasn't chaotic. It wasn't messy. It was controlled. By someone who knew the terrain. By someone who made sure the bodies were found, just not too soon. You want to know the most chilling detail? There was a timer. Yes, a literal kitchen timer, set to go off at 11:15 p.m. That's 6 minutes after Romy's 911 call. Was it coincidence? A twisted joke? Or was someone trying to time the discovery? The timer was inside the microwave, not running anymore. But the last setting showed 11 hours and 15 minutes. A coincidence? Or a final flourish? When the FBI finally stepped in, they said what local officers had already begun to fear. This wasn't just a murder scene. It was a message. And that message? We're still deciphering it. But one thing was clear. Nick Reiner had turned his childhood home into a stage. The dinner, the table, the script in the guest house. Every piece was deliberate, and every piece was pointing towards something no one wanted to admit. The killer wasn't just part of the family. The killer thought the family had it coming. But the real twist came next, when investigators opened Nick's laptop and discovered a folder labeled Final Draft. What they found inside would make the entire crime scene look like a rehearsal. At first, the case seemed local. A double homicide in Brentwood. No forced entry. A family member arrested. Open and shut, or so it seemed. But the LAPD detectives working the case knew something didn't sit right. The scene was too clean. The emotions didn't match. And most of all, the suspect, Nick Reiner, didn't act like a man whose parents had just been slaughtered in the room next door. There was a coldness to him. A void. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't confused. He was calculated. And that's when the lead investigator made the call. They needed more than a homicide team. They needed profilers. They needed the FBI. The Bureau didn't hesitate. Rob Reiner wasn't just a celebrity. He was a man with powerful political connections, a former close ally to high-profile figures, and a prominent voice in media and activism. His murder, and the disturbing possibility of a premeditated family annihilation, elevated the case instantly. Within 24 hours, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, was deployed to assist. And what they found would shake even the most experienced agents. The first thing they did was start from zero. Fresh eyes, fresh assumptions, fresh psychological profile. And they began with the crime scene photos. No blood on the walls. No hesitation marks. Single strike fatal wounds. Almost no evidence of panic. That alone told them something chilling. The killer didn't hesitate. Not with the first victim. Not with the second. There was no mess. No struggle. Just death, delivered with surgical focus. And that meant one thing. Premeditation. But what sealed it wasn't the photos. It was the laptop. Recovered from Nick Reiner's guest house, the silver MacBook was neatly placed on his desk, lid slightly open. Password protected. No problem for the bureau. Within minutes, they were inside. And what they found wasn't just unusual. It was a manifesto, hidden in plain sight. A folder on the desktop titled simply, Final Draft. Inside the folder, scripts, notes, audio files, and one document, timestamped 12 minutes after the estimated time of death, titled, Silenced by Legacy. The document began like a screenplay. Scene 1. Int. Dining room, night. An aging man sits at the head of the table. His wife beside him. They eat in silence. The air is thick. The sun enters, unseen. But it wasn't fiction. The details matched the real crime scene exactly. From the table setting, to the food served, to the placement of the bodies. It wasn't creative writing. It was a post-mortem confession, hidden inside a script. And it didn't stop there. The next file? An audio recording. Just under 3 minutes. Nick's voice. Calm. Measured. Detached. Everyone keeps asking what I wanted, he says. But it was never about money. Or fame. Or revenge. It was about freedom. You can't be free when you're born into a story written by someone else. So I rewrote mine. Then silence. Then a chilling click, like a record button being stopped. You ever hear something so cold it doesn't even sound angry? That's what the agents heard. This wasn't a rant. This wasn't a breakdown. This was closure, in Nick's mind, anyway. He believed he had done something profound. Poetic. Necessary. That's what disturbed the agents most. But let's rewind. The FBI wasn't just there for digital forensics. They brought in Dr. Claire Hanley, one of the top profilers in the Bureau. She'd worked on some of the most infamous domestic murders in recent history. She was known for one thing, getting inside the mind of the unseen motive. And when she read Nick's scripts, all of them, she issued a chilling summary. This wasn't about a moment of rage. It was an execution of a narrative Nick had written years ago. She mapped the evolution of his writing, from angsty teen fiction to disturbing psychological thrillers. From stories about misunderstood sons to scripts where the only resolution was blood, and every single one ended with the same structure. The death of the father, the silence of the mother, and the rebirth of the son. At this point, the FBI turned their focus to one key question. Was Nick acting alone? Because something didn't add up. The timeline, the lack of evidence, the missing murder weapon, and most of all, the unknown DNA recovered from the back porch. If Nick had planned every detail, who left that DNA? They re-examined the security system. Though there were no cameras in the guest house basement or bedrooms, the main house had perimeter motion sensors, which had logged something odd. A second motion spike at 9:37 p.m., just outside the East Garden entrance, 20 minutes before the murders. The footage was too dark to identify anyone, but the gate had been manually unlocked. By who? Nick never left the property that day. No one else was recorded entering, unless they were already inside, or had a code. And that's when Romy's name resurfaced. Her access to the estate hadn't been revoked. She knew every inch of the property. She had a key and a code. But was she involved? Or was she another target? Her deleted text message, the one from Nick, had raised eyebrows. Things are going to change tonight. Don't come. Was that a warning? Or a threat? The FBI interrogated Romy for over 4 hours. She didn't break, didn't waver, didn't cry. She said she deleted the message because she was scared, not because she was involved. She denied knowing anything about Nick's journals, or the scripts, or the growing rage. But her final words caught the lead agent off guard. I told them years ago, she whispered. I told them Nick was dangerous. They didn't want to believe it. So what now? A possible accomplice? A family cover-up? Or just a brother and sister caught in a story so twisted no one could tell the hero from the villain? One thing was clear. The Reiner estate wasn't just a crime scene. It was a psychological theater. Every room, every drawer, every note, and the most damning clue of all, a sealed black box found under Nick's bed, secured with duct tape and labeled in red marker. For after. Inside, a handwritten letter, a list of names, and a map of the entire house, with circles drawn around specific locations, including one spot that would soon reveal the FBI's worst fear, that the murders may not have been the end of the story, but only the beginning. Let's talk about the black box. Every investigation has a moment where everything shifts, a moment where suspicion becomes certainty, where whispers become screams. For the FBI, that moment came when they opened the sealed black box hidden under Nick Reiner's bed. Not locked, not encrypted, just duct-taped shut, almost like Nick wanted it found, like he wanted the final word, after everyone else had lost their voices. Inside, what they discovered wasn't just evidence. It was a portal into the darkest corners of Nick Reiner's mind. And what it revealed would turn this case from a double homicide into a manifesto of madness. First, the contents. The box contained, for leather-bound notebooks, a printed floor plan of the Reiner estate, a flash drive, a crumpled photograph, and a single torn page with 5 words. "They never heard me scream." That line alone sent chills down every spine in the room. Because Rob and Michelle hadn't died screaming. They died silently. But now, the silence had a voice. Let's start with the notebooks. Each one was dated. Volume 1, 2018, The Echoes. Volume 2, 2019, Inheritance. Volume 3, 2020, The Rewrites. Volume 4, 2021 to 2024, End Scene. Yes, Nick had been documenting this for at least 6 years. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't triggered by a sudden fight. This was a long-brewing descent, chronicled like chapters in a novel. Inside The Echoes, Nick wrote in fragmented, poetic language. Entries like, "They raised me in a house of echoes, their voices, their choices, bouncing off the walls until I couldn't hear my own. He told me I had potential. She told me I had problems. They both left me in rooms with no doors." You read that and think, this is pain. Deep, unfiltered pain. But then, things shift. In later pages, the tone turns sharper, colder, purposeful. To fix a broken legacy, sometimes you have to burn the foundation. Not all stories end in redemption. Some end in silence. That's where mine begins. It was clear Nick wasn't just writing to cope. He was writing to justify. Volume 2, Inheritance, is where things get disturbing. This notebook reads more like a blueprint than a journal. It includes surveillance sketches of the Reiner property, notes on alarm blind spots, sleep patterns of Rob and Michelle, lists of medications in the master bathroom, written plans labeled Plan A, Plan B, and, horrifyingly, Plan C, the dining room scene. Let that sink in. Plan C, the dining room scene. He named it like a film sequence. And it matched, down to the table placement, the exact positioning of the victims the night they died. Now here's where it gets terrifying. Next to each plan, Nick wrote, "Rehearsed." And underneath that, initials, dates, check marks. He wasn't fantasizing. He was practicing. Over years. In secret, one FBI profiler described it as the most detailed long-term premeditation I've ever seen in a domestic crime. This wasn't just calculated, it was choreographed. Volume 3. The Rewrites contained emotional entries, but with a twist. He wrote letters to his parents, never sent, each one growing more twisted. "Dear Mom, I tried to be soft, but softness gets stepped on in this house. Dear Dad, the only time you listened to me was when I was being someone else. So I became someone else." And then one line, underlined in red, with a smear across the page. "You didn't raise a monster. You ignored one." But it was Volume 4, End Scene, that fully unmasked him. That notebook was different. It wasn't handwritten. It was printed, stapled together like a script. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, each section titled like a movie. Each character assigned a real name. Rob equals the director. Michelle equals the handler. Romy equals the witness. Nick equals the rewrite. And under Nick's character, a single note. Breaks the story. Rebuilds the world. Now remember, this was written before the murders. Some pages were dated 6 months earlier. Some, disturbingly, just days before December 14th. The final page, dated the exact morning of the murders. The last line, "Tonight, the curtain falls. You still think this wasn't planned?" Then came the photograph. It was old, faded. A picture of the Reiner family, smiling at an event. Rob with his arm around Nick. Michelle kissing Romy on the cheek. The back had something scribbled in pen. You can only fake this for so long. Investigators believe Nick carried this photo for years, possibly as a reminder, or a warning, or both. And finally, the flash drive. Encrypted. Took hours to crack. Inside. Videos. Dozens. Recordings Nick had secretly taken over years. Family dinners. Private arguments. Phone calls. Even therapy sessions, somehow recorded without consent. He'd cataloged everything. Time-stamped. Labeled. As if building a case against his own blood. But one folder stood out. Titled, Romy_Truth. Inside. Recordings of his sister. Nothing violent. Nothing damning. But intimate. Private moments. Phone calls to friends. Crying in her bedroom. Journaling aloud. The final clip? Romy, in tears, saying, I wish I could help Nick. But I think we've already lost him. Nick had labeled it. Betrayal. Let me ask you, is this the behavior of a victim? Or a predator? Because what the FBI saw wasn't just a man coming undone. It was a man who'd already let go of reality and replaced it with his own story. Every piece of that box was a confession, but not the kind you write in desperation. This was an orchestra of vengeance. Nick wanted control over the past, over the narrative, over how his parents would be remembered. He didn't just take their lives. He took the right to interpret them. But the final page in Volume 4 held the greatest horror. A list, titled, Scene 5, the sequel. And under it, 3 names. Romy, Jordan, Nick's former therapist. Marcus, a former writing partner who distanced himself. Each name had notes beside it. Plans, dates, venues, possible climaxes. Nick wasn't done. He was just getting started. So the FBI acted fast. Romy was placed under protection. Jordan and Marcus were contacted. All were shaken. None knew they were targets. Or characters. You think the black box was just a collection? It wasn't. It was a playbook. And it revealed something worse than murder. Intent to continue. This wasn't a man who snapped. This was a man who had turned his life into a movie, with himself as writer, director, and executioner. And the final act? Wasn't over. But even with the black box and evidence, one question haunted investigators. What triggered him to act that night? Why December 14th? Why dinner? Why then? The answer would come from an unexpected place. An email. From Rob. Scheduled to send that very evening. But never opened. Because he died first. And what it said would change everything, again. What if everything you thought you knew about the crime scene was wrong? That was the realization setting in as forensic analysts began their work. Not with emotion, not with theory, but with science. Because while people can lie, misremember, or hide, evidence doesn't care about narratives. It just exists, waiting. And in the Reiner case, it was waiting everywhere. Quietly, patiently. The FBI's forensic team started where the murders were discovered, but they didn't linger there long. The main living space had already been documented extensively by local investigators. Clean lines, minimal disturbance, evidence that felt curated. Instead, the Bureau focused on the places most people overlook. Edges, seams, transitions, the spaces between rooms. That's where truth usually leaks out. Let's begin with the floors. On the surface, the hardwood in the main house looked immaculate, recently polished. Not a single obvious mark. But under forensic lighting, specialized wavelengths designed to reveal traces invisible to the naked eye, something emerged. A faint pattern. Not a trail. Not a pool. More like transfer. As if someone had moved through the space after contact, carefully avoiding leaving a mess. The pattern wasn't random. It followed a route. From the dining room, through the side hallway, toward the rear entrance that led to the stone path connecting to the guest house. Not dripping. Not frantic. Controlled. Now here's the first major contradiction. If the attack happened entirely in the dining room, as initially assumed, why did analysts find trace evidence along that specific route? It suggested movement. Post-event movement. Meaning someone left the scene and went somewhere else. And that somewhere else pointed straight toward Nick Reiner's living space. Next came the fabrics. Curtains. Upholstery. Clothing. Michelle's sleeve showed evidence of contact with a rough surface, something textured, not fabric. Rob's jacket had a similar transfer, microscopic but present. That texture matched the carpeting in the guest house hallway. not the main house, the guest house, which raised a deeply unsettling question. Had one, or both, of them been there that night? Or had the person responsible brought something back with them? Either way, the guest house was no longer just adjacent to the crime. It was connected. Then came the walls. Specifically, the baseboards. You'd never think to look there, right? But forensics did. And what they found changed everything. Behind the removable baseboard in Nick's bedroom, secured loosely, as if taken off and replaced repeatedly, there were signs of attempted cleaning. Not thorough, not professional, but deliberate. Chemical residue, the kind used to sanitize surfaces. Common household products. Nothing exotic. Someone had tried to erase something, and missed. Under the bed, beneath the area where the black box had been stored, analysts discovered something else. Microscopic fibers. They didn't belong to Nick's clothing. They didn't belong to the bedding. They matched Michelle's sweater. The same sweater she was wearing when she died. Now stop and think about that. How does a fiber from Michelle's clothing end up under Nick's bed? There are only a few possibilities, and none of them are innocent. As the lab results came back, the picture sharpened. The timeline began to shift. This wasn't a simple case of an attack in one room. Evidence suggested movement between spaces. The main house, the guest house, possibly back again, like a loop. And loops, in forensic terms, suggest planning. Then came the mattress. Nick's mattress. Analysts don't just look at surfaces. They look inside. When they opened it, they found trace evidence consistent with contact. Not prolonged, not violent, but present. Enough to confirm one thing beyond doubt. At some point that night, someone else had been in Nick's bedroom, and that someone had come from the main house. Now let's talk about the knife. Or rather, the absence of it. The missing kitchen knife from the block was never recovered. But forensic analysts don't need the weapon to reconstruct its use. They examined the knife block itself. Tiny metal shavings. Indentation patterns. The order of removal. The missing knife wasn't taken in a rush. It had been selected, and it wasn't returned. That alone told investigators the weapon had likely been disposed of intentionally. But how? And where? That question would linger until the search expanded beyond the property. 2 days after the murders, a maintenance worker cleaning a storm drain nearly half a mile away found something unusual. A kitchen knife, wrapped in cloth. He reported it immediately. Forensic testing later confirmed it was from the Reiner home, and traces found on it linked it directly to the crime. But here's the twist. The cloth it was wrapped in? It wasn't from the main house. It matched a towel from the guest house bathroom. So let's recap. Evidence indicated movement from the dining room to the guest house. Contact between Michelle and Nick's personal space. Attempts to clean trace evidence in Nick's room. The weapon wrapped using an item from the guest house. This wasn't coincidence. This was choreography. But the most unsettling discovery came last. And it came from a place no one expected. The washing machine. Nick had told police he hadn't done laundry that day. But when forensic teams checked the machine, they found signs of a recent cycle. Inside the filter, residue consistent with fabric fibers from 2 separate individuals. One matched Nick. The other matched Rob. No visible stains. No dramatic evidence. Just enough to say something had been washed. And it wasn't clothes from a normal day. At this point, the FBI stopped asking if Nick was involved. They started asking how much he controlled. Because the forensics didn't just place him near the crime. They placed him after it. Cleaning, moving, disposing. All actions that happen once a decision has already been made. But there was still one lingering anomaly. The unknown DNA from the porch. Analysts revisited it with more advanced testing. It didn't belong to Nick. It didn't belong to Romy. It didn't belong to Rob or Michelle. So whose was it? The answer wouldn't come immediately. But when it did, it would blow the case wide open. Before that happened, the FBI compiled everything. Every fiber, every trace, every movement. They laid it out visually. And when they did, one thing became unmistakably clear. The crime didn't happen in one place. It happened across the property. Across time. Across intention. This wasn't rage. This was execution. And here's the chilling part. The forensics showed restraint. No excess damage. No chaotic indicators. The kind of restraint you see in people who believe they're right. People who think what they're doing is necessary. People who don't see themselves as criminals, but as authors. The FBI brief ended with a single sentence written across the whiteboard. Evidence supports a planned, multi-location act with post-event management. In plain terms, this was planned. This was controlled. And it didn't end with the murders. Because just as investigators felt they were closing in, a new piece of evidence surfaced. Not physical, digital. A device no one had noticed before. Hidden inside the guesthouse ventilation system. A small, outdated phone. Powering it on revealed one unsent message. Drafted. Time-stamped. Addressed to someone the FBI hadn't seriously considered yet. And what it said suggested the truth might be far more complicated than anyone imagined. Every crime scene holds secrets. But sometimes, the loudest confession doesn't come from a weapon, a fingerprint, or even a body. Sometimes, it comes from a file. A digital ghost. One that doesn't shout, doesn't bleed, but whispers everything. And that's what the FBI found when they powered up a thumb drive tucked inside Nick Reiner's guest house, specifically hidden inside a hollowed-out ventilation duct behind the bed. It wasn't labeled. It wasn't encrypted. It wasn't even dusty. Almost like it had been placed there recently. Intentionally. The moment analysts plugged it into a secure device, they knew this wasn't just another hard drive dump of bad poetry and angry screenplays. This was a library. It contained a single folder labeled, "Open when you finally get it." Inside, 11 video files, 6 audio recordings, 14 Word documents, 1 PDF titled, "The Rewrite Doctrine," and 1 file with no extension at all, just the name, romy.mp4. Let's start with the videos. Each one was time-stamped. Each had a title. Titles like, Father, the Illusionist. Mother, the Handler. Inheritance, a Curse. This is what you never saw. Why December 14th matters. When agents opened the first video. Father, the Illusionist, they saw a close-up shot of Nick, sitting in what appeared to be the base.